Okay. So this is our third and final session. Before we start diving into text together, I want to mention a few things, and then we'll do a little bit of review and then dive into texts. First of all, as if you've been a learner with me before, you know, but I'd like to say in case there's anybody new on the call, that 95% of the time, I don't see the chat. I'm looking at you and I'm looking at texts and I'm thinking, and I'm not able to also see the chat at the same time. So I hope you also know that I will pause and see if there are questions or reflections between sections or even more frequently. And if you don't get to ask your question today, I hope that you'll get to ask it another time in learning with me or in another learning setting. I put the source sheet in the chat, and I'll do that one more time just in case anybody's come on since then. So I'm doing that now. Okay, so I'll share with you also that the document is available for everyone while we're together, while we're learning together on our call. It will not be accessible after we end our learning today, but My Jewish Learning does send out, as most of you know, I think, a source sheet. So if you hang tight for a few hours or until tomorrow, whenever they are able to send it out, you'll get a PDF of the source sheet to reference. So I think that's about it for our introduction. I will share my screen as we get started. I'm just double checking my notes here. Okay. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, great. Okay. I'm adjusting so I can see you also. And many people know also my second monitor is behind me, so I look off a little bit during our learning time together. So I apologize if that feels a little bit awkward. So we've talked really extensively about different names for God, and I hope we're able to get to at the end of our time, because our learning has impacted me in the way that I think about my relationship with a higher power. And so I will be curious to hear at the end if not only has this been, I hope, stimulating and interesting intellectually, but I also will try to remember to ask if this has impacted your relationship to the divine, to a higher power, to a sense of what some like to call also a higher purpose. So I'm making a note of that. I hope I see it at the end. I just made a post-it. So let's review a little bit what we've done so far. And actually, there's one more piece that I want to say, that we've talked a bit about, do we say God's name in prayer settings and in learning settings? And I've shared with you that in learning settings, I do say God's name, but I also try and be sensitive to others that are not 100% comfortable with that. And so certainly as we read text out loud, I leave it to you to say whatever name you're comfortable with. And I kind of go back and forth. That's where I'm at. This class has actually made me more sensitive. And so I think these days I find myself avoiding it more, but in a learning setting rather than a prayer or blessing setting, I will say the 4-letter tetragrammaton, as it's called. So you can see here, we talked about Yahweh, or God's 4-letter name, as signifying various things like being, or God, or the characteristics of God that are more compassionate than strict or rigid. It's Israel's personal name for God. It's not 100% clear to scholars how that name sort of was adopted by Israel, but it was. And yet there are also times in the Torah that we looked at where God even though the name is supposed to generally signify compassion, it also signifies sometimes God as a more strict God. And at the same time, Elohim or El or Eloha, which appears, that name, our tradition says, Jewish tradition says that it does signify a judgment-oriented God rather than a compassion-oriented God. But we also saw that flipped. And really throughout the 5 books of the Torah and beyond, there's a lot of gray, but both our names, Elohim or Elohim, a more general name for God that entered into the lexicon from surrounding cultures, and also Yahweh, the personal name for God, the Israelite name for God. Last week, we looked at one really interesting name, El Shaddai, which is not, the translation is not 100% clear, but this is a God who is often associated with the forefathers. We studied a few texts where God promised blessing and descendants and fertility to the forefathers. And also, even though there were times like in the book of Ruth, where Ruth uses the name Shaddai to mean, I didn't have a family, I didn't become fertile, and says, don't call me Ruth anymore, call me, or sorry, Naomi says this. Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant, call me Mara, which means bitter. And at the same time as God is seen as offering fertility, offering blessing, Psalm 91 uses the name Shaddai in very much a protector mode, God as a comfort or as a protector. So I'm going to just switch my screen for a moment. And I'll make this bigger. I would just want to show you one text that we started with at the beginning of our time together a few weeks ago. And I'll make this screen bigger. That this is a text from Maimonides, who lived primarily in the 12th century, but died in the 13th century, who outlined the names of God. And we've covered all of them except for Adonai Tzvaot. And I'm not going to translate that quite yet, but we are going to take a look at that name today to round out our study, especially of the names that Maimonides outlines. And also beyond Adonai Tzvaot, and again, I want to just adjust the screen so I can show you what's coming. Just have to number that. I hope that we'll also have the opportunity about halfway through our time together to talk about a name for God that isn't listed in Maimonides' names, but that appears in Genesis 16 and I think is worth our time. So I hope we'll get a chance to also look at Adonai Ro'i, God who sees me, the God who sees me. And also, I do hope that we'll get to spend time together on looking at a few rabbinic texts and added names in rabbinic literature after the destruction of the temple in 70, other names that the ancient rabbis developed for God, and then to talk about as a whole what names resonate the most for us. And again, if this study has impacted our own understanding or relationship with a higher power. So with all that said, I want us to start with a text in 1 Samuel in the books of the prophets. And I will ask for a reader for this text. Okay, I don't know, my screen's a little, I don't know why it's jumping. Let me see if I can just get it to, okay, you'll forgive, I don't know why the view button is highlighted here. It's, I think I have a lot open, and when Zoom is open, things slow down. So you'll forgive that. Okay, so we are going to do our best. And again, forgive the, I don't know why the menu, the drop-down menu is in our view a little bit, but I want us to take a look at a David and Goliath excerpt and think about Adonai Tzvaot, the way that this term is being used here. And then we'll also add on a few other texts. So can I ask someone to go ahead and read? And let me just bear with me for a moment as I Let me refresh and see if that helps. That does seem to have helped. Okay, and again, Zoom is a little bit slow. The document is a little bit slow when Zoom is working. So would anyone like to be our first reader for today and take a look at 1 Samuel? Allow us all together to take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 17 with a snippet from the story of David and Goliath. You can raise your hands or unmute. Okay, I see Ava Apple. So Ava, thank you so much. You can go ahead and unmute.
So
and I'll scroll
starting,
down. Starting, yep, all
where
of text 1. So verses 44 through 47, and I'll scroll in English, of course.
okay. And the Philistines said to David, "Come to me, that I may give your flesh to the birds of the sky and to the beasts of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come at me with sword and spear and scimitar, but I come at you with the name of Yahweh of the forces on high, the God of the ranks of Israel, whom you have mocked. This day Yahweh will turn you over into my hand, so that I will strike you down and will remove your head from you. I will give your carcass and the carcass of the Philistine camp this day to the birds of the heavens and to the wildlife of the earth, so that all the earth may know that Israel has a God, and that all this assembly may know that it is not with a sword or with a spear that Yahweh delivers, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give all of you into our hand."
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So I highlighted a number of things here that I clearly wanted us to take a close look at. Adonai Tzvaot is often translated as God of hosts, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Everett Fox translates this phrase as God of the forces on high. Tzvaot are generally understood to be some kind of celestial beings, or hosts is a name that's been given in the past. And it's understood, even though monotheists sometimes question this, it's understood that God is not in the heavens alone. That is part of our tradition. It's not the only part, but there are tzvaot that are with God, angels, some other beings, we don't know exactly. But I think Everett Fox does a beautiful job here translating, in the sense that we don't know exactly what these forces are, but our tradition thinks of them as some kind of force, some kind of spiritual or divine force with God up on high. And then you can see what Ava read in Hebrew. For any Hebrew readers here, I will point out the Hebrew and the English. God is also called Elokei Ma'archot Israel, God of the ranks of Israel. And David references God below here too, where God says, you think you seem incredibly powerful, way more powerful than me, but Israel has a God. Israel has Elohim, a God, and Yehoshia Adonai, God will deliver. God delivers. Even if it's not with a physical spear or sword, God will help me conquer you. And in fact, we know that David overpowers Goliath. So as we can see here, and in some sources that we'll take a look at above, God is sort of, I would suggest, a commander, the head of forces up high, or perhaps, as this text suggests, not just forces up high, but also the commander. God is in charge of Israel and brings Israel along, and can allow Israel to be victorious. So God up above as a commander and God below as a commander. So let me pause here with this initial text and see if there are any reflections or questions. And in particular, I want to begin to think about, does this characterization of God, a God of the forces on high, who's clearly in charge, and also a God of the Israelite forces below. Is that a God that you feel a sense of connection to? Or perhaps there are other characterizations that we've discussed so far that you might feel a stronger connection to? So Heidi, let's start with you and we'll take it from there. So Heidi, I think you can go ahead and unmute, but keep your hand raised so that we can see you.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. Here's what crosses my mind when I see God of the ranks of Israel, or Israel has a God. It's sort of like it's our God. Then I ask myself, is there anything that says God, that God has adopted anybody else, any other nations? Sort of like, is it like, so this is the God of Israel. And then is there any literature that says, and that God also looks after other nations if that God feels, how could I
Yeah.
say, suitable?
Yeah.
Like,
So,
are we the only ones chosen, I guess, is what I'm asking.
yeah, it's a really interesting question. The verses that I'm familiar with that use the phrase Adonai Tzvaot, and I scroll down to Isaiah so that you could see another translation. This is Robert Alter's translation, Yahweh of the armies. You can see that here, it's also very connected to Israel, and the epithet that follows Yahweh of the armies, Adonai Tzvaot, is Israel's mighty one. So usually this phrase, as far as I know, is connected not only to not to a God, a force, a military kind of force in the universe for different peoples, but specifically for Israel. We'll see a little bit of a change in the verses to come. I just want to ask our wonderful moderator for today. I'm seeing a lot of people come into the waiting room, and I'm wondering if you can go. I'm going to admit the people that just came in, but I just want to see if you can continue to admit those folks. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Are there other questions or reflections on this verse? And also just keep your hand raised until we are until I've responded, until I've finished responding, so that I can, I have the opportunity to dialogue with you. Okay, so Paul, you can go ahead and unmute if you're able to do that, and keep your hands raised.
Yes, quickly, verse 47 interests me. God delivers. Can you explicate delivers? Thank you.
Yeah, so in Hebrew, the word here is Yehoshia. It may sound familiar because the name of Moses's mentee or protege is Joshua, which means both of these words, Yehoshua and Yehoshia, mean God delivers, God saves. That's the idea here. In Hebrew, Jesus's name is also Yeshua. So the idea of God being God saving or delivering. And often it's used in the context of something military. But for example, I think in Isaiah is the verse, Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Ya'anenu B'yom Karenu. God will save or deliver. The king will answer us in the day that we call. And that's a verse that we say in Jewish tradition. The Havdalah service is recited on Saturday night at the end of Shabbat. And there are a number of verses there about God saving or delivering in preparation of the coming week. Does that help? Okay, great. So we're going to actually keep going. Yvonne, I see there are a couple hands raised, but we are going to keep going. And then hopefully those who have hands raised will get the opportunity to ask questions a little bit later. So Robbie, I'm going to ask you to lower your hands, and then we will definitely pause again for your reflections. Thank you so much so far for your participation. So in this second text here, this is an unusual text. At the beginning of Isaiah, God is describing the unethical state of Israel. And in verses 23 and 24, we can see that God is telling Israel what they did wrong. And then we'll see what happens, the use of God saves in verse 24. So I'm going to go ahead and read 23 and 24, and then we'll take it from there. So your nobles and your knaves and companions to thieves, all of them lust for bribes and chase illicit payments. They do not defend the orphan, and the widow's case does not touch them. This is all about Israel, and you've probably heard this before if you've studied the prophets or studied prophecies in predicting the destruction of the temple. This is one of the reasons given for the destruction. The Israelites, the Judeans, were not socially conscious. They did not take care of those least fortunate. Therefore, says the Master, Ha'adon, Adonai Tzevaot, Yahweh of the armies, Israel's mighty one, in Hebrew, Avir Yisrael. Oh, I will settle scores with my foes and take vengeance on of my enemies. And in this case, that seems to be Israel. There are many cases in the prophetic texts where God uses this kind of language for the enemies of Israel, but here God uses the language for Israel. So because they did not behave properly, Yahweh or God will not only be their advocate and their commander and bring them into victory, but there are times where God sees it worthy to turn on his own people and subject them to a punishment because of their behavior. We're going to read one more text, and then I'm going to pause again. So this is another, we're about to see, you can see I have a number of intro notes here. We're about to look at a text that you may know if you're familiar with Jewish liturgy at all, with the daily Jewish prayers. And if you're not, I will explain. We're going to read 3 verses here from Isaiah chapter 6. The one that I'm highlighting, you may have heard in Hebrew, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot. Holy, holy, holy is Adonai Tzevaot. And this is a phrase that's repeated 3 times in Jewish liturgy daily. The first time is before the Shema. There are a number of blessings. And within those blessings is a little bit of call and response in the morning. And then in addition to that, in the Amidah, and actually this could be recited 4 times a day because the Kedusha, the call and response prayer, is part of morning and afternoon services. So in the Kedusha, in the call and response prayer, in the repetition of the Amidah, the standing prayer, this verse is also repeated. And in addition to that, if you stick around at services until the end, the concluding prayers also have a call and response with this verse. So the rabbis clearly wanted us, the rabbis who gave us the verses and implanted them in our liturgy, they clearly wanted us to pay attention to this verse. And there's a lot of strange things about this chapter. Isaiah has a vision, the prophet Isaiah has a vision of God on high. And we know from other Isaiah texts and from other texts that the temple, the actual temple down below in Jerusalem, was often compared to, or you could say this vice versa, a heavenly abode. So Isaiah seems to be doing that here. So we are about to read Isaiah's vision of God that seems connected to the temple in Jerusalem itself. And the language, it's you may be familiar with it, but it's a strange vision of God. I want us to pay attention not as much to the details of the vision, but to the way in which holiness fits or maybe doesn't fit with God of hosts or God of armies. So I'll read this text also. So in the year of the death of Uzziah, which is in the 700s BCE, although the date is debated, I saw the Master seated on high and lofty throne, and the skirt of his robe filled the temple. So Isaiah imagines that God's robe is full of not the temple below, but God's abode above. Seraphim were stationed over him, 6 wings for each one. I have a few notes above that I'll call your attention to in a moment. With 2, it would cover its face, and with 2, it would cover 2 wings, it would cover its feet, and with 2 wings, it would hover or flutter, says Robert Alter. And each called out, saying, each of the seraphim, these beings, called out, "Holy, holy, holy is God of the armies. The fullness of all the earth is his glory." So I'm hoping that this text surprises you and maybe even confuses you in some way, because we've seen so far that other mentions of God of armies or God of forces on high seems to be God as a warrior, as a fighter, a God of Israel, but a God that can also turn on Israel. And here, surprisingly, and perhaps confusingly, we have a sense of holiness associated with a God who is a fighter. So I would like to suggest that perhaps Isaiah, or a segment of our biblical tradition, didn't necessarily think that Adonai Tzvaot was maybe a satisfying enough epithet for God. Maybe it was a difficult idea, as personally I find it a little bit of a difficult idea, that God is a fighter and has these military characteristics about God. But when we think about holiness in connection to a fighter, I know there are some maybe modern or not even modern, but some challenges that we might have with that. But I'm going to ask you to think about it a little differently than what we often hear about in the context of a holy war. Perhaps there's a tension here between a God of the armies and a softer God, a God who is holy or sacred and fills the earth in some way. When we think about fighting or battling, there's almost something single-minded about it. There's a single-minded vision. There's a conflict between 2 parties or more. And yet when we think about holiness and holiness filling the earth, perhaps it's a little bit of a different vision. That's a God that's everywhere all the time, not necessarily a God of conflict. And so I want to suggest to you that maybe there is this tension right here in this verse, and there are a couple of other similar examples that I didn't bring with me today, but where God is somehow both sacred and holy and everywhere at one time, accessible, and then also sometimes God is a battle, or a being that's battling or fighting and has more of a single-minded focus. So I want to pause here and see what you might think, where you might be landing with these ideas of God as the army head, Yahweh of the armies, God of the forces on high, and also in particular, verse 3 here, which seems to mix both holiness and fighting. So I'll pause here. Yvonne, I see that you, I know you were raising your hand last time, so you can go ahead and unmute, but keep your hands raised. I don't know if you're able to unmute or if our moderator is able to unmute you. Okay, so.
Oh, okay.
Okay, great.
Now I'm on mute.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful.
Having lived in Israel for 9 years, I can't help but think about Israel's situation when I arrived, and it was almost the 73 war, like a couple of months before.
Okay.
So I see all this fitting so much into the situation of Israel itself. We have the Israeli army throughout the wars and since the beginning of the state of Israel, having God at its side and being very successful. God as the helper, the commander, and even encouraging the Israelis to continue in this belief that God is always with them until the 73 war, when it was a big problem, and a lot of the Israelis, were disappointed with the outcome. On the other hand, we have the very Orthodox that do not go to the army, and I can see then the conflict. They do believe that whatever resolution for the problems of Israel will come from their God, no? Elohim Tzvaot or Adonai Tzvaot. And there is evidently the conflict between these two sides, which are God will take care of us because he's our commander.
Mhm.
And the Israelis that do participate in the army and say, look, we've had our lesson, God is with us in partnership, but he can also turn against us, like you said. So I see everything fitting into the reality of Israel as
Yeah.
I experienced it.
Yeah. Okay, Yvonne, thank you. And thank you for ending with "as I experience it." That
As
is
I
very, I really want to appreciate and kind of raise our appreciation for Yvonne. Go ahead and raise your hands again so we can see you. Yeah, just so we can see you. Okay, there you are. Thank you. So so thank you for saying as you experience it. That's not something that all of us are guilty of saying, no, this is my interpretation and it's the only interpretation. So thank you for sharing. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your experience and the way that you kind of see the verse in different ways based on your experience. It's wonderful. And it is difficult. I often share on my Torah portion class, and I see Joni, who is one of my Torah portion students, that I often share that what we do when we read Torah is one of two things. I mean, we do lots of things, but we either do pshat or we do drash, meaning we look at the text in its contextual, with its contextual meaning. What's the surrounding history? What are the surrounding verses? What is the context? What about the surrounding ancient Near East? What should we understand about it in order to understand a verse? And then there's something else that we do. We take a verse and we take our personal state of being and we read into the verse what we want. And I have a teacher who I always quote saying that her name is Malka Strasberg, that is what has sustained the Jews over time. We are an interpretive people. We read into the text something that we find meaningful, which is exactly what I did when I suggested that there's a tension in this verse. Is there really a tension in this verse in a historical, literary, I'll just say historical context? I'm not sure. But for me, I struggle with seeing God as a fighter. And so I want to see the sense of holiness being repeated 3 times. And a verse that the rabbis have us read 3 or 4 times a day, traditionally speaking, to think about holiness. Does holiness perhaps triumph over a God of the armies? So I don't have a definitive answer to that. And I would never say that my interpretation is the only one. So I will also say is my experience sitting here in 2023 is I want to see a more sacredness, a more accessible spirituality rather than a fighting kind of spirituality. So I'm gonna, I saw Martha's hand, and then Greta and Sandy, I'm gonna ask you, we're not gonna get to you right now, but maybe you will be able to share a bit later. So Martha, will you share your
Hi.
question or what
Yes,
Yes.
I'm just kind of associating this with the emanations of God.
Okay.
The Sefirot.
Okay, say more.
When you say the din judgment, I kind of see Yud Hey Vav Hey, and when I see the loving kindness, I see Adonai. So I'm associating a lot of this name for God as being different emanations of God.
Yes.
Because if I don't look at it that way, you can look at it as if we have different gods, just like Egypt, who, if you read the Book of the Dead, they say that actually the Egyptians were believing in one God, but the other gods, they were just kind of different names.
Mm-hmm.
So for me to separate, to make sure, is that I see it as a different emanations of God, all these names.
Yes, beautiful. So I would bet that many people here are, Martha, keep your hands up for a bit if you don't mind. Keep your hand raised. Many people here are familiar, and I don't want to take the time to pull it up, but many people might be familiar with the Kabbalistic interpretation of God as having 10 sphirot, or 10 spheres, and you beautifully explains, Martha, one of them at the top of the sphirot is this difference between compassion and judgment, and we see that in the texts and in rabbinic tradition. When Kabbalah was developing and the sphirot were becoming more popular, there were challenges, and other non-Kabbalistic rabbis were concerned that perhaps this is heresy. Perhaps this is talking about different kinds of gods. But in fact, the Kabbalists tried to, and perhaps successfully, defended their position. No, these aren't multiple gods. These are different emanations, different characteristics of God. And I think we can see that here too. Not only do we have a being that is loving and compassionate and specific and personal, we also have a being that's more harsh and strict, and perhaps Adonai Tzvaot fits with that God. I don't necessarily know where Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh as sort of a descriptor of God might fit, maybe somewhere in the middle, but definitely, yes, we are immersed in all these different characteristics that the Torah and Jewish tradition gives us for God. So Martha, thank you so much for bringing Kabbalah into the mix today. And Sandy, hopefully we'll get to you a little bit later. So I want us, in our remaining time, to take a look at some rabbinic texts. And also, I don't want us to leave these 3 sessions without taking a look briefly at one of my favorite texts with a descriptor of God. So you may know already the story of Sarah and Hagar, the foremother Sarah and her handmaid Hagar. There are 2 similar but separate stories, one in which Hagar runs away from Sarah after Sarah is quite aggressive toward her, and God actually tells Hagar in this story to go back to Sarah, and God says, don't worry, I will make your son, who you are carrying, you're pregnant with this child, with this baby, he will become a great nation. So just go back to Sarah and don't worry. A couple chapters later, Sarah, through Abraham, kicks Hagar out of their home for good. And again, God, or a being of God, a messenger of God, reassures Hagar. I want to just call our attention here. This is Genesis 16. I want to call our attention to verses 13 and 14 toward the end of the first story that I just described, where Hagar is in the wilderness and she's struggling, but she encounters God. And in verse 13, we read, now she called the name of Yahweh, the one who was speaking to her, you, God of seeing, El Roi. For she said, have I actually gone on seeing here after his seeing me? A little bit of a strange verse, but we'll come back to it in a moment and focus on seeing. Therefore, the well was called. There was a well near her where she was able to see that there was water that she could use to allow her child to drink for herself. Excuse me. The next story has her giving her child water. Therefore, the well was called Well of Living One Seeing Me, and in Hebrew, Be'er Lachai Roi. Be'er Lachai Roi. And the Torah tells us here it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Bared, it should be. So in this text, God's messenger finds Hagar and reassures her, and she feels seen, and she says, this is a God who sees me. And so as we make our way, kind of sort of finishing up here, the biblical texts where we've seen Yahweh, Adonai, Elohim, El Shaddai, all of those names having both most of them having a kind of duality about them: compassion, judgment, presence, distance. And here we see, falling kind of into the compassion category, a God who sees Hagar, a God who allows a person, a divinity, a presence that allows a person to be seen. And I think it's worth, as we're wrapping up today, thinking about what that means and what that might mean to us and all the different depictions of God. What does it mean today to have an encounter or a relationship or feel a sense of presence and feeling a sense of being seen? So we're not done yet. I want us to make our way into some additional rabbinic names for God, and then we'll pause again. So let's go ahead on the heels of thinking about a God who sees. Let's do that. Let's continue on now with some names that the rabbis created for God. So we'll do a few of them together. We'll take a look at text 5. I may summarize text 6, it's a little bit long, and then text 7, and we'll explore possibilities for these names and what they might mean to us. So one name that the rabbis use frequently, and that I grew up with my rabbi saying a lot, was HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, or the Blessed One be He. This particular Mishnah is a section, a rabbinic text within Ethics of the Fathers, or Pirkei Avot, from about the year 200. And it's in a set, it's really a conglomeration of pieces of wisdom from a collection of wisdom sayings and wisdom from the rabbis. And in this Mishnah, they first talk about our sense of humility and also the ways in which our awareness of our humility can help us to avoid sin. And then they say, before whom are you destined to give an account and reckoning? Before the King of Kings, the Holy Blessed One. And you can see here, again, you might be thinking about, okay, King of Kings, that seems very ruler-like, perhaps someone that enforces law, has total authority, and yet there is this sense here of the Holy Blessed One, someone who is further, or a being that's perhaps in some ways further removed, but when we think of holiness, we think, I hope, of a sense of comfort, of a divinity that fills the universe, as we saw earlier. And so here too, we have a sense of duality of God. Combined with Kadosh Baruch Hu, we also see this epithet, Melech Malchei HaMelachim, God who is a King of Kings. So I want to keep going, and then we'll pause again. I want to summarize this Mishnah here. This is a story of Choni HaMe'agel, Choni the circle maker. You may be familiar with some of his stories. There are various stories about him in rabbinic literature. In this one, without reading the story, which I hope you'll read on your own, it's a fun story to read. In this story, Choni prays to God on behalf of the people who are asking him to pray. And this story is supposed to take place sometime before the destruction of the Second Temple, maybe around the year 30 BCE, maybe a little bit later. And Choni says to God in a different way than we've seen in biblical texts, Ribono shel olam, master of the universe, ruler, Rav, is the same word as teacher or rabbi, ruler, master of the universe. And with that epithet, with that name, Choni says, the people need rain, please help and give them rain. And it's a word that's often used in prayer, a phrase that's often used in prayer contexts. So I'm going to keep going here, and then we will reference all of these again. And actually, I want to stop here before we go on, and then we'll read text 7 together. So these added epithets here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, along with King of Kings, and also the sense of Ribono Shel Olam, master of the universe. In the context of prayer, this character Choni is praying for the people to have an appropriate amount of rain. And Choni is expressing the idea that really only God can control that. So let me pause here just with these added words. I know we didn't dive very deeply into each of these texts, but I want to just get your initial reaction to these phrases, the Holy Blessed One combined with King of Kings, and also Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the Universe, and see how they resonate with you, how they land on you. And then we're going to read a text together. Let's pause here. Are there reflections or questions about these added layers? And certainly I'll share my thoughts, but I want to check in with you first. Okay, so there may not be. Is everyone sure? No questions or reflections at the moment. Okay. Okay, so let me share again that I think what the rabbis are doing in a couple ways are to some extent, they're generalizing the names of God, and they're using holiness to become one of the names for God. And we're saying, God, it's true, the rabbis say here, God is also a King of Kings, but God is also a holy being, the holy being. And so when we think about God and we encounter all different words in the Torah, maybe the rabbis are asking us to focus on holiness, sacredness, distinctness, how we can have a relationship, how we can live in a spiritual plane with a higher power, with those around us. Holiness and sacredness is perhaps what they're asking us, what the ancient rabbis are asking us to think about when they start using the phrase HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, and then with Ribono Shel Olam, I want to suggest something a little different. With Master of the Universe, rather than thinking about a softer sense of sacredness, I would suggest that with Master of the Universe, the rabbis are also acknowledging God as an ultimate force behind nature, an ultimate decision maker in the universe. When they call God Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the Universe, that doesn't ring as a sense of God as a softer, quieter sense of sacredness and holiness. We think perhaps more of the God of Sinai, a God who is in charge, completely in charge of even natural forces in the universe. So we have kind of a duality here, like a diametrically opposed duality that continues from the Torah. We saw in the Torah the same kinds of things. God is sometimes portrayed in a softer way, and God is sometimes portrayed in a much harsher way. So we're going to keep going. So Martha, you may get to share something in a little bit, but we're going to read this last text and then we're going to pause. So one other name for God here is Hamakom. So you might have heard in contexts related to making a Shiva call when someone is sitting Shiva mourning the loss of an immediate relative. There is a traditional phrase that Jews are asked to say, and I'll just say it for you so that you know it, or you hear it. Hamakom Yenachem Etchem. May the source or the place comfort you. Betoch Shar Avlei Tzion v'Yerushalayim, among all other mourners of Zion in Jerusalem. So there's a sense of calling on God, and we'll read this text in a moment, and then we'll fit it with that saying. There's a sense of calling on God, a God that can offer comfort, but we're calling God the source or the place. So I want us to think about why that is as we read this text. And it can be a little bit confusing, but I hope it'll be enlightening also. So can I ask for another reader? We had, I think Ava read for us first. Can we have a second reader for today for text number 7? Joni, okay, great, I see you. So go ahead, and I think you should be able to unmute. If you can't, we'll ask our moderator. Okay, wonderful.
Rav Huna said this in the name of Rabbi Ami. What is the reason that we substitute the name of the Blessed Holy One with the name Makom? It is because God is the place of the world, and the world is not the place of God. Rabbi Yitzhak said, we do not know if the Blessed Holy One is the place of the world, or if the world is God's place. But from the verse, God, you are a dwelling, we see that the Holy Blessed One is the place of the world, and the world is not the place of God.
Okay, so let me unpack this just a little bit and then we'll pause for discussion. Ava, I like your hearts. Thank you. So in this text, and this is an excerpt from a rich text that I'll encourage you to look up. There is a translation on Sefaria. So in a rabbinic discussion, one rabbi says, like, okay, for some reason we've decided to substitute hamakom, the place, the source, for Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And it doesn't mean all the time, just means we have another name for God here. Why? Because God is the place of the world. You might be saying, like, what does that mean exactly? So I want to offer a few possibilities here. When we say God is the place of the world, I think what we're saying is God is the core, God is the center of the world, God is everything, God is everywhere all at one time. Rather than God being transcendent and above the world, God's presence is immanent. God is with us, God is here in the universe. Someone, I think it was Martha, who brought Kabbalistic perspectives into our discussion today. The Hasidic perspective, God is in everything. God is in my pen. God is in the computer. God is in even the mundane. There is something about that. Again, some opposers to some, an opposition to that is that it doesn't quite ring like monotheism. However, there is this sense here in this rabbinic text, Mikomo shel olam. God is the place of the world. The world and God are interchangeable. And when you read here, there are two verses that are being quoted here. One of them is, God, you are a dwelling, from Psalm 90, which I can add here. Adonai ma'on ata, you are a dwelling. And the rabbis in this text decide that thinking, conceptualizing of God as the place, as the world, makes more sense to them, at least in this passage, than thinking about the world as the place of God, than thinking about God as the master over the world. God and the world are more synonymous than the distinction between God as transcendent with the world below, or with God ruling over the world. So as we're making our way toward the very end of this series and today's session, and we've seen, as I've suggested, many different kinds of dualities, and we'll talk about those. I will kind of bring that all together in a moment, but I want to pause here and see if there are reflections or questions, whether they're clarifications or general reflections on this verse here, on this passage, where the rabbis conceptualize God as the place and therefore being called Hamakom, the place, or if there are questions or reflections on today or the previous two sessions also. So we'll have time for a couple. Martha, I do see your hands, but I just want to see if there's anybody who hasn't yet shared a question or reflection that might want to have the opportunity to share their voice today. And then let's see if you can share again. So I want to open up our Zoom room for anyone who may have a question or reflection who hasn't yet shared today. And I know, Greta, you wanted to share earlier, so thank you for raising your hand. You can either go ahead or unmute, or our moderator will unmute you, and keep your hand raised.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask something about Adonai Tzvaot, because the two texts you highlighted there both seem to have sort of an underdog or a justice correlation to them. And I wondered, is that a tendency generally with that name of God, or is that just happenstance those two texts happen to be more I don't want to say retribution, but more about like
Yeah.
righting wrongs, evening
That's
the
a great
world out.
question. That is a great question. I don't know definitively. I'd have to look up a few more of those verses. In the other one that we saw in that third text, there isn't that sense of retribution or justice, but that's a great observation. Thank you for sharing that insight. Can email me if you want, and I can look into
Thank
that
you.
a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Okay, Robbie, I know you haven't yet shared today.
I don't see a contradiction
Okay.
in these two statements. First of all, if I think of the world, well, first of all, I believe that God is everywhere, but I also believe that God is inside me. So if I think of myself, so God, world is not a place of God. Yes, I think there is a place inside me, a place in the world for God. And at the same time, God is everywhere. And so I don't think there's a contradiction.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would say that that's in today's world, you know, in 2023 as moderns, I don't think we necessarily have to see things as mutually exclusive in the way that maybe, well, even today, some people want to make a choice between this kind of God or that kind of God. And our tradition, at least Jewish tradition, has a tremendous amount of diversity, as we've seen, in the names of God and also in the characteristics of God. And I think somehow I found myself actually on some level comforted with the idea that God can be a warrior, that if there are times in my life where I need to push forward as a warrior, and push forward, you know, advocating for myself with great strength, that is a time where I'm not sure it's a bad thing to think about a guide or a higher power helping me in that way. And then there are other times where, as you may recall from the first or second session, we talked about one theory about the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and the original possible meaning for that. And although in Exodus, the sense there is being everlasting and ongoing presence, that one scholar, Israel Knohl from Hebrew U in Jerusalem, has shown through his research that he thinks that the origin of that name comes from the Arabic, from love. So there is a sense of sometimes God will be, perhaps it is, our spirituality is more so an assertive one, and sometimes our spirituality may be a spirituality of love. So Martha, if you can share very briefly, we need to end in a minute. So if you can share in just a few seconds, I want to give you that opportunity. And keep your hands raised.
No,
Very briefly.
I was thinking about the dwelling place that God dwells within us. And the thought that comes to my mind is that when we say that God created us is his image, not the physical, because God does not have physicality. So when I hear God is everywhere, is within us, and we are co-creators with God. And when you say that I do this, it's the God within you, and that we are sacred as well as human beings because we are created in his image.
Okay.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that in our last moment together. So I think it's a great segue to end, actually, Martha. Thank you so much. All of these characteristics that we've described certainly, I think, reflect who we are and how humans have seen God over millennia. And so I hope that you'll take with you from this session not only the names and the characteristics from the series, the names and the characteristics of God that resonate for you, but even the ones that don't, to allow us to challenge ourselves spiritually as we make our way into the high holiday season. So thank you so much for being here. And I very much look forward to seeing you next time I teach for My Jewish Learning, which I think is on Friday, September 8th. I think I'm teaching Parsha that day, the Torah portion that day. So I hope to see you then. And thank you so much again for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.